I'm Peter Austin. That is a former place of execution for convicted witches, and this is interesting. Why do I always end up talking about capital punishment on this channel? I don't know. Anyway, witchcraft was first made officially illegal in England in 1542, under legislation known as the Witchcraft Act. And though these laws were repealed, reinstated, and amended on several occasions throughout British history, the long and short of it is that witchcraft was an offence punishable by death for most of the early modern period in England, and technically right up until 1736. At this point, though, the legislation changed rather dramatically with the introduction of the Witchcraft Act 1735. But if you believe everything you read on the internet, this act also meant that until 1951 you could go to prison for a year for giving a weather forecast. But why is this? And more to the point, is it even true at all? Well, let's find out as we take a closer look at England's Witchcraft Acts. In March of 1649, 30 people from here in Newcastle and the wider county of Northumberland were accused of witchcraft. The timing of this is hardly surprising, actually. This was the height of England's witchcraft paranoia, and just over the border in Scotland, the 1649 to 1650 trials were taking place, resulting in more witchcraft executions in a single year than at any other time in British history. In fact, our 30 accused witches were examined by a professional witch finder from Scotland, sent for specially by local Puritan magistrates. The methods of investigators and prosecutors did of course vary quite dramatically over the centuries of European witch hunting, but we happen to know that the witch finder in our case was particularly keen on publicly stripping the accused and searching for the devil's mark somewhere on their body, which was really just a birthmark, scar, or some other imperfection. This painting is actually from an American incident, but the principle is very much the same. At the Newcastle trials, these marks would be pricked with a pin, and if no blood was produced, this was taken as evidence of witchcraft. And with a fee equivalent to £100 per conviction, our Scottish witchfinder, whose name is not recorded, certainly had a vested interest in getting as many guilty verdicts as he could. In fact, there's even some suspicion today that he may have used a pin with a retractable point, like those joke shop daggers with the spring-loaded blade that sinks into the hilt. This would of course stop the point of the pin from piercing the skin, and therefore no blood would be produced. In any case, what we do know for sure is that 15 of the 30 were found guilty of the crimes put to them, and brought here to Newcastle's Town Moor area, where they were hanged before a large crowd, as depicted in this illustration published a few years later. The last executions for witchcraft in England took place in the 1680s. Some believe the final victim was Alice Molland, tried at the Exeter Assizes in 1685, but while we do know she was convicted of the alleged crimes, there's no actual record that the death sentence she was given was ever carried out. If not her, then, the final victims were likely the 3 women accused at the Bideford witch trials: Temperance Lloyd, Mary Trembles, and Susanna Edwards, also tried in Exeter and hanged in 1682. It was around this time that convictions were fortunately dropping off due to increased skepticism around the supernatural aspect of the crime, and when the Witchcraft Act 1735 was passed, the law surrounding magical practice changed significantly. This legislation repealed the old crimes and instead set out to punish such persons as pretend to exercise or use any kind of witchcraft, sorcery, enchantment, or conjuration. You see, with the old superstitions fading fast, it was now illegal to defraud or intimidate somebody by pretending to be a witch. But what's this got to do with weather forecasts? Well, you see, when we look back on the traditional role of magic in British society, particularly in rural communities before the early modern period, we have to consider the cunning folk, who were, generally speaking, seen as distinct to the frightful old hag figure you might associate with witch trials. The practice of cunning folk is a dense and nuanced topic that I couldn't begin to summarise properly here, but broadly speaking, these individuals employed incantations, ritual objects, herbal remedies, and even Christian prayer to aid those who came to them for help, whether it was for a physical ailment, a worry in their life, or even concerns that they'd been cursed by some other malevolent magical user. Cunning folk were also thought to have fortune-telling powers, often called upon to find items that had been lost or stolen, perhaps to divine the name of your future spouse, and occasionally to predict changes in the weather and seasons. And this is where we get those claims all over the internet that weather forecasts were once illegal under English law. The fact is that though they were typically seen as helpful members of the community, the cunning folk were still at risk of persecution under the various witchcraft acts for their magical practice, including weather prediction. Okay, so that makes sense in a superstitious historical context, but the real question is, did weather prediction remain illegal in England until the mid-20th century, as is so often claimed online? Well, let's just take a look at the legislation. The exact wording of the Witchcraft Act 1735 is that if any person shall pretend to exercise or use any kind of witchcraft, sorcery, enchantment, or conjuration, or undertake to tell fortunes, every person so offending shall for every such offence suffer imprisonment by the space of 1 whole year, and once in every quarter of the said year, in some market town of the proper county, upon the market day, there stand openly on the pillory by the space of 1 hour. The pillory being a public shaming device once common in Western Europe. Now, the crucial thing here is that this phrasing does not actually include any sort of distinction or definition with regards to fortune-telling. And at the time of the 1735 Act, weather prediction on any kind of meaningful scale would have been considered a supernatural feat. It wasn't until the introduction of the electric telegraph in the 1840s, which allowed for the quick exchange of information over long distances, that a formal and scientific forecast of the national weather became possible. So yes, technically speaking, it was illegal under the 1735 Witchcraft Act to claim to be able to predict the weather, and yes, technically speaking, this legislation remained in place until 1951, when it was repealed by the Fraudulent Mediums Act. In fact, the most famous case of someone being convicted under the 1735 laws took place in 1941. This was nothing to do with weather prediction, but it's worth talking about anyway. In 1941, Scottish medium Helen Duncan claimed to have been contacted by the spirit of a sailor killed in the sinking of HMS Barham. At that stage, the sinking was technically an official secret, with only the families of dead crewmen having been made aware. But Duncan had probably heard gossip on the subject, and so included the information in her séance, which did not go down well with British authorities. However, the major caveat here is that no one was really in any danger of being imprisoned for a year, or indeed pilloried, for producing a weather forecast in 1950. For one thing, pillories themselves were no longer a permitted form of punishment, but more to the point, meteorology was a serious science at this stage, and not in the least bit supernatural, so it couldn't be argued in a court of law that a professional weather forecaster was actually trying to pass themselves off as someone with magical gifts. So no, in practice, nobody at the Met Office was in any danger of spending 12 months in the slammer for doing their job, but was it still there in the somewhat poorly defined legislation? Absolutely. All it would have taken is one insanely authoritarian change of leadership, and your grandparents' equivalent of our TV weather forecasters could have found themselves doing porridge for 12 long months. Talk about fortune-telling, I bet they wouldn't have seen that one coming. I've been Peter Austin, and that was interesting.